Hi, welcome. Today is Wednesday, April 12th, 2023. We are at the University of Notre Dame in the state of Indiana on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, including the Haudenosaunee, Miami, Peoria, all of the Potawatomi peoples, and particularly the Pocagnic, Potawatomi, Pokagon, Potawatomi, who have been using this land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so. I have the immense pleasure today of interviewing poet ire'ne Silva. Good afternoon and welcome to the Institute of Latino Studies.
Thank you.
For archival purposes, may you please state your full name, date of birth, and birthplace.
All right. So ire'ne Silva. Birthplace is actually Locklin, Texas, which is close to Lubbock. Mm-hmm. What was the other thing you asked for? We just
date
had
of
lunch.
birth.
Date of birth.
Date of birth.
So February 5th, 1975. And as y'all will notice, Institute for Latino Studies, ire'ne Silva, same initials.
Oh my God.
Yes, so I'm like every time I see it, I'm like, those are my initials on the logo.
It's
yes,
me.
It's meant to be.
Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so let's begin with childhood and influences. Mm-hmm. So if you don't mind sharing a bit on your childhood and upbringing, rather than asking the age-old, and I find at least complicated question of where did you grow up, I thought I'd ask instead, or parallel to, how do you define home based on your most integral childhood memories?
Home then would have been actually the road. Being on the road would have been home. Since my parents were migrant workers, they drove trucks. And so we would do the circuit from South Texas, close to Corpus, Bay City, up to Oklahoma, Hereford, and then back to the valley in South Texas. And so it was always the circuit. And so I always remember, driving places. I think that was my favorite part of everything, was being in motion, or just that circular feeling of everything. Now I think, even now when I think of home, I get homesick for the valley, and I get homesick for like West Texas and Guyman, and a little bit the childhood memories of New Mexico. I'm a little homesick for those. I just lived being homesick for a little bit of everything. So that was mostly childhood, that would be the places where. But it's interesting, this morning I was in the hotel room across the street, and I was working on emails, and I was listening to, my current soundtrack lately has been Cristian Nodal and Ángeles Azules, all the different duets. And I was thinking how odd, like in the last few weeks I've been in Denver, I've been in LA, and I've been here, and I'm listening to the same soundtrack.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because right now that I'm thinking of childhood, like the same soundtrack followed me, through wherever we were. So and of course I always think of like driving and having the radio playing. And so I grew up with a lot of conjunto music and tejano music, rancheras, and then 80s music and and then my parents were older, so a lot of like 50s, 60s rock. So it's like that whole combination. So both the roads and the music, I think, were what I called home. Yeah. In the same way that now I think home follows me around because I'm listening to the same soundtrack no matter where I go. Yeah. And so that shapes that.
I can definitely see that working in so much of your work, where it's just the cyclical nature of language, and how so much of your language can be so musical at the same time.
And like the rhythm, because like you think the rhythm of like the sound of wheels on road, the sounds of like wind coming in through the windows, and just the fact that it goes on and on and on and on. And so like it seems to make sense for words to sound that way on the page. Like, the rhythm takes you where you need to go next. Yeah. Like sometimes I find the questions that people ask about how you write poems or how you write stories, and I'm like, don't any of you hear the rhythm? You just follow the rhythm. The rhythm tells you where to go. Yeah. Not in like the Miami Sound Machine, who was it that the rhythm's going to get you? Was that Gloria Stefan?
I think so.
Yes. Yeah. So, but that kind of feeling, it just, you follow where it takes you.
Yeah.
And so it, that's a natural thing. And I think when people ask me like what were my first poetic influences, I think of like Cornel Lorena and Los Relámpagos del Norte, and like their lyrics, the way that they hone the lyrics to be both simple and easily understood, but also these really complex metaphors. Yeah. Like the lyrics to Hilos de la Mente. That is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And then Mil Noches is still one of my favorite songs. But things like that, that kind of, that feel of that.
I can see that for sure. And that goes straight into the next question of what can you recall as your first encounter of poetry in all its possibilities, including the space of orality and performance, and where do you see the adorations or perhaps fears of your upbringing in music, literature, dance, food, or theater, etc., permeating into how you approach your work?
Did you say fears?
Fears or adorations,
fears.
Yeah.
I think mostly it's adoration. I think it's mostly been adoration. Turn that around in my mind a bit. All right, so answering it in a tangent. I was telling a friend last night that I actually am not this angry all the time. I forget what I was starting to explode, but I said, I'm very peaceful. I laugh a lot. I start in a lot of things, and occasionally get very mad. But I think there's a poem I wrote when I was 19, 20. And actually I can't even remember what it's called anymore. But I was trying to talk about how love and rage are interconnected. So I think for me, like the adoration, fear, it's probably the pole is love and rage. But in the poem I was trying to explain or describe how love finds its roots in rage, or rage finds its roots in love.
Yeah.
That, like, injustice. Most people would say, well, that makes you angry. Well, why does it make you angry? Because something you love is being hurt. Or something you love is being damaged or being harmed.
Yeah.
So that's what launches, that rage. You think about history, you can think of it in terms of, again, what do you love? What gives you rage? The fact that you feel it personally and not as an abstraction. The fact that you would look at history and not just reduce it to dates and places and names, but to people's actual lived experiences. And then you look at the world around you and just interacting with it on a daily basis. Again, it's everything between, the extremes of love and rage, and then all the places where that gets mixed.
Yeah.
So then I think that releases, it holds so much energy. And I don't know any way to release it other than through poetry or through writing.
Yeah.
And then also too, like, why, I don't know, I couldn't see myself writing or wanting to write if it wasn't coming from somewhere on that range between love and rage, because then what would be the point? I think that's why I've never understood people who, like, need prompts all the, like, I feel like I have, they're not all published yet, but pretty much I've written 9 or 10 books at this point. And there's still so much. There's still so much that I want to release that it seems odd to me that to not have an idea, to not have a thing to want to write, to not have the next thing. I was telling someone, I think that's why I write the next book, because I have to finish one because I really want to get to the other one.
Yeah.
And so you eventually have to put it down and say, I'm done, or you'd never get to the next thing. And there's so many next things that I want to get to. That's what keeps me finishing things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is not on the script, but now I'm just curious. Your take on writer's block, like that whole concept around just the inability to have words when you're essentially a wordsmith, right?
So, okay, 3 different things, because I have a lot of opinions about writer's block. One, this whole idea that people are supposed to write every day is ridiculous.
Yeah.
I've gone days, weeks, months. I probably have gone a few years without writing. But wanting to, or thinking that you have to produce like thousands of words a day makes absolutely no sense. I think that's one of these like capitalist society expectations of production and whatever else. Like, writing is so much more than just making, than just putting the words down. So that's part of it. So, I mean, there should be no expectation of being able to do that all the time.
Yeah.
The other part is that a lot of times when people say they have writer's block, I feel like a lot of it, and I know I recognize it in myself too, there's times when I have to stop writing, and I realize that there is, some emotional or psychological untangling I have to do before I can write the next thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's also a matter of respecting the work. I was telling somebody earlier that I was telling Francisco's class that this idea of writing simmering, I like. Because in my mind, I figure I have about 12 burners. Yeah. And so the projects I'm working on are in the front, and they're going at a high speed, and everything else is simmering. Yeah. And it might look like it's off, but it's still on. It's just simmering. So you've got to give things their time to develop. And people never talk about that. They talk about the putting in the time to write and sitting at your desk. Yeah. But it's not that. You also need living time and thinking time and feeling time and experience time to be able to get that thing out. Yeah. And so respecting that is part of the process. But a lot of it sometimes too is just we're not willing or able to face whatever it is that we need to write the thing. I mean, this is also looking at the fact that people write different things. So there are people that, they write and they just produce and produce and produce and that's what they do. And then there's other people that write and, it's a spiritual quest or it's an emotional healing or it's some other combination or a cultural reclamation. So there's different reasons for writing. So that also affects the whole thing of writer's block. But yeah, I think a lot of it is, and I'm kind of hardcore about I don't want to hear that it's writer's block unless you are at the absolute end of your rope and in despair because you're not writing and you've tried everything. Then I don't think it should be called writer's block. It's just a pause or you need to wait or you have work to do. Yeah. For the most part. And I think someone came close to unfriending me for saying that. But I'm like, people really cling to this idea of writer's block and it's not. I mean, you've got to accept the flow however the flow works.
I think you're definitely right on the fact of, it is very much society influenced of next thing, let's go.
A friend of mine was telling me how she was seeing that there's certain, people's careers that she was following. And they seem to be on a production schedule, like a book every 2 years. Yeah. And I was like, I've been called, what have I been called? I've been called lots of things. That I'm writing a lot. And it is, but my projects, I mean, this novel that I'm supposed to get around to finishing this year, I've been working on and off for 17 years. The short story collection that I just finished, I started writing in 2005. So it's like I've been writing them simultaneously, but they've had a lot of time to become what they are. But yeah, we don't have any respect for that. Yeah. For just, it takes what it takes.
Next thing, yeah. On writing practices and poetic themes, you write in your essay, La Desembocada, I fell in love with words the first time a book was read aloud to me in kindergarten, but it was also books that told me I did not belong, that named me outsider, other, foreign, that told me all these words I loved were not mine. In what ways do or might you be conceptualizing language as potentially violent, and how do you as a poet navigate this nature? How is it you are so beautifully able to craft a true sense of belonging within your work?
Well, the first thing I think is that people wielded language as a weapon to say I didn't belong and to make me feel that way. Everything from, I was telling a story the other day about the first time I remember really being called wetback. I think I was 8. Yeah. And I threw a desk at somebody for it. And got in trouble, but fine. And all the ways that people, the other strange memory that I was having, when my first year at Cornell, I'd be talking to people, passionate about whatever topic I was talking to them, and then they would look at me and go, oh, you have such a lovely accent. And apparently they hadn't heard a single damn thing I said. Yeah. And then, of course, when you learn language, or rather you expand your vocabulary through reading, you sometimes have no idea how to pronounce things. But you know the word, you know its meaning, you know everything. And then you find out, it's pronounced fatigue. It's pronounced, whatever. So, little ways, and very blatant ways. But I think it was in Austin, probably in the early 2000s, that it was odd. I came to, then I wrote a poem about it. I wrote a poem about everything. But I kept thinking about that tension between English and Spanish and what it meant. And then, of course, all our indigenous languages and the ways they've influenced English and Spanish and then everything else that's crept in too. But I think I had an epiphany one day and I was like, English is presented to us as this completed thing, as an entire thing. And we don't realize how many things have influenced the English,
Mm-hmm.
how much Spanish there is in English. We don't realize how broken English is. Like it itself, in a way, is a mosaic.
Yeah.
And once I realized that both English and Spanish
Mm-hmm.
are both that, they're both mosaics. They're both broken. They've both been fed into Mexican Spanish. How much indigeneity is in the language?
Yeah.
And not even words, but like, what was it? I read an interesting article recently about how all the diminutives in Mexican Spanish, which apparently doesn't happen anywhere else, that's all related to Nahuatl uses of speaking that way. And so that's influenced even the shape of it.
Yeah.
I saw something else where they were saying that the Texan y'all, is a parallel because people needed a Spanish verb, an equivalent to the Spanish way of addressing a group of people. And so that's where y'all came from, because there was no English equivalent for it.
Yeah.
So if you think of it that way, then both languages are broken. And then in that sense, all poetry and fiction, all language use, each one of them is the practice of making a mosaic. So then it doesn't matter if you use English or Spanish. It doesn't matter if you speak your English with a Spanish structure.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you sneak in indigenism like everywhere, because every single use of it is a mosaic. But it's how often how often do we hear that we can reclaim language that way? To realize it's broken.
Yeah.
So we can take the broken pieces and do whatever we want with them. And interesting, it was after that actually I mostly started writing in English.
Really?
with a lot of bits and pieces of other things. But I was actually writing a lot more Spanish and a lot more bilingual poetry before that. But once I realized, well, it's all broken and it doesn't matter, then I was like, okay, well, now I can write in English and be fine with it, because I hear the Spanish in it, and I hear the the indigenous uses or rhythms or whatever. I hear it in the English. And what a thing it does to feel that way about the language you write in, the language you mostly live in, to feel like it. English is not foreign. English is also mine, and the way that I speak it is perfectly fine. So that changed a lot of things about writing for me.
Yeah. I love that. Similar experience. I feel like that is such a pinnacle moment for any Latina poet going through the identity crisis of what is language to me. Being a linguist.
Because otherwise, how are you going to create in something that you can't claim as yours?
Exactly.
It has to be yours for you to be able to mold it and shape it and move it and fire it and do whatever else you do with it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Love that. Similar, that belonging is so concentrated in all of your work, and I love it. I very much envision your work crafting and recrafting conceptions of belonging as home or as body or grounded within the self as body. Your poem, I Like the Words on My Skin from Cuicacali, is one such stunning example. So would you mind doing us the honor of reading this poem aloud so that we may hear the vitality of your words?
Thank you. Is it one of the little tabs?
Yes.
Okay, I'll hear you. All right, so I like the words on my skin. Words meant for me first, making my skin into paper, like the blank page before words, like the page overflowing with words, like a page of poetry, half ink, half white space. Weren't they there always, waiting to emerge from beneath my skin? Not the needle injecting ink, but the needle piercing the skin, releasing the ink. You will not persuade me that sometimes it isn't blood that runs in my veins. What else is like this, mine before it was mine, waiting for me only? No one else will see these writing lines of black and red, symbols from all my languages, moving like twisting serpents across my skin, bursting like riotously blooming vines, exploding with green leaves, each leaf holding within it a breath. I trace each line, my fingers come away dripping ink. I bring my hands to my mouth, ink enough to transform breath into words. When I am gone, this is what will remain of me, everything I couldn't contain, spiraling galaxies of ink, everything I fought to give. Somebody was asking me recently about like that they felt a shift in my writing in the last few years,
Mm-hmm.
or I don't know what, some shift. And I was telling them what happened was, I realized that even though I've been writing since I was a child,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it was until the last 3 or 4 years that this shift happened where I would say probably 85% of my energy for writing
Mm-hmm.
was going to fighting myself to get to the page.
Hmm.
And sometime in the last 3 or 4 years, I stopped fighting myself.
Mm-hmm.
So now I can give all the energy I have
Yeah.
into figuring out whatever I have to figure out to get to the page and then to do what I do on the page.
Hmm.
And it is so freeing.
Yeah.
It is so freeing. I didn't know that was going to happen. I didn't even know to dream for it.
Yeah.
But when it happened, it changes everything.
Mm-hmm.
It changes all of it.
Yeah.
But I like the last line of that poem made me think of that because it has been more than 30 years of fighting to figure out how to get myself to the page,
Mm-hmm.
and how to figure out language, and how to figure out writing, and how to figure out stories, and how to figure out poems,
Mm-hmm.
and books and whatever else. But yeah, there's something amazing about when you stop fighting,
Mm-hmm.
or rather when you don't have to fight anymore.
Yeah, that intuition, that ability to just give in.
And give it.
Yeah.
And give it.
Mm-hmm.
It's beautiful.
Absolutely. And not an easy thing to discover or figure out.
It took 30 years. It took me 30 years, almost 30 years to figure out.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. How has exploring your Indigenous roots and identity affected the way in which you approach your work? When reading, I can very much see the ways in which land and body and like rootedness run beautifully rampant throughout all the topography of your poetry. But I'm curious to know how you, from a writer's point of view, see those connections affecting the actual process of writing and how you envision working within your poetics.
So also in this morning's class, I was talking about, it's a very Western thing to separate the physical body from the spiritual body, from the emotional body, from the psychological body, the historical body, the future body, the family, the community bodies. It's this very strange thing of like trying to splinter and fragment people. And so one of my concerns in all writing has always been to address the whole, all the fragments at once. Or maybe it's at different levels to address all of it at once. And so I think of that as being a more Indigenous framework than being a Western framework of thought, or approaching language or stories or poems. It's how do we talk to all of it at once? How do we embody all of it at once? How do we call that out of the audience? Just tell people, let's sit here for a moment. Let's read this poem. Let's look at this. And in this space of time that we're looking at this, let's all be our whole selves. In this moment. And so that's why so much of that, I want to pull all of that in. Thematically, especially with Cuicacali, with that collection, that was one of the main concerns. It's like, how do we navigate that strange Latina space between, being indigenous heritage and not just heritage or of Indigenous descent, but like when I think of it, so much of the way I grew up, so many of my beliefs, so many of my were very Indigenous. So it's not just that once my great grandmother was blah, it's that we still live in those traditions and those beliefs, but yet we can't claim Native American status federally. And like I was telling someone too, I claim Mexican American even though I only have one grandparent that's from Mexico. Yeah. And for a lot of people that wouldn't be enough to claim something. But I grew up in Texas, so I might as well, as I say, it's northern Mexico. So so it's like these cultural, familial, everything influences. And then with my short stories, I was asked a very interesting question by a class in Fresno, by the professor who asked me, did you write this as a deliberate fuck you to the Western canon? And which made me crack up. I still think it's funny. But it's like, that was not the intent. That wasn't the intent behind it. The intent was to write the stories that I needed to write the way I needed to write them. And right now, I've been going for the past couple of years. I just wrote a tiny little essay for a collection on BIPOC futurism that takes that talks about Toni Morrison and the white gaze. Because people usually think of that as being about marketing and audience.
Yeah.
But I had this conversation and I just, my brain exploded. But I was talking about, it's not just marketing and audience. It's that the white gaze assumes all of these different relationships between people and nature, people and time, people and each other. The fact that, people have to be the center of the story, that it can't be a story about nature or a story about time or a story about land or a story about whatever. All these assumptions about what's what. But what happens if you unhinge all of those assumptions? Then you can tell different stories. And so I think when I was writing the first set of stories, the Flesh to Bone stories, I didn't quite know that's what I was doing, but that's what I was doing. And so now that I've written a second set of stories that I just finished, these I wrote knowing what I was doing and what I wanted to do, which was to unhinge those assumptions and get to the stories that we haven't heard yet, because we have been so trapped and in this cage and trained to think these are the only kinds of stories you can tell, and there's only one way you can tell it. So what happens when we unhook all of that? And futurism is one of the interesting ways of looking at it, because we're unhinging how history happened, and we're doing an alternative take on it, or we're looking at sort of unhooking the present day expectations to what the future might be. But what if we did that now? We talk a lot about visualizing a world without borders, or visualizing justice, or visualizing all these different things. And I always think of something, hopefully Luis Rodriguez said this, because if not, I've been misquoting him, but that it wasn't just important to imagine a world without borders, but that we had to live in the world as if there were no borders. Like, in order to manifest it, we had to, it wasn't about imagining, it wasn't about a future, it wasn't about an if, it was about a now. Now this is what this is, now this is what the world is. So what if we do that with assumptions about, reality or history or causality? Or one of the big things that I've been having lately is a debate over looking at Latina and looking at Indigenous or Native literature. And kind of evaluating them and thinking about, or rather critique, like I want to know what I'm reading and what I'm accepting into myself. And the important thing that I've been finding is that when I read things that are modeling powerlessness or hopelessness or voicelessness, it fills me with despair. And I want to limpia afterwards, or I have to go read another book that then fills me up with hope and love and brightness, and even in the middle of describing difficulty or historical issues or whatever else. But to want that. And so I think sometimes I'm afraid that in a lot of Latina literature that we're caught in describing hopelessness and powerlessness and voicelessness. And so it's like, I'm looking, for lack of a better word, I'm looking for the medicine. Where's the medicine? I want to see transformation. I want to see power. I want to see healing. I want to see not getting wounded. I want to see, I want to hear that. I want to know what that sounds like. And every now and then I'll find it somewhere. But in the meanwhile, going back to Toni Morrison, it's you write the things that you need and you don't find. So that's what I'm trying to write.
Love that. And you have definitely been one of those poets for me, of just like reading something that isn't really out there. I agree with you. Any Latina book that you pick up, it's a repeated story. We're going around in circles just telling ourselves that we are the victims and always will be. And something that I found really comforting in your words is just like the fact that you can embrace all of yourself, absolutely everything about yourself. And that's not something I've been able to find very much.
Because how many places do you see where, clash of language or identities or cultures, it's always described as being painful. And I'm like, so that's the reason whenever I get around to finishing this first novel, that's one of my main, the impetus behind writing that novel is, yes, there's pain and suffering. I grew up with, life is pain and suffering. I do believe life is pain and suffering. But the culture is not part of the pain and suffering. I'm not blaming culture or multiculturalism for the pain and suffering. That's just life. And poverty and injustice and a bunch of other things. But it's not the culture. Cultural culture is a source of resilience, a source of inspiration, a push for, pushes for adaptation, for activism, for all these different things. It's not pain. And why are two languages seen as a painful thing? When it's such a beautiful thing that expands. You have, literature now in two languages. You have music in two languages. You have, other languages are accessible because you have two. You can talk to that many more people. Why is it pain? It's not pain.
It's opening yourself to the world.
Exactly. And who was it? Somebody wrote a beautiful essay about, it was about actually indigenous languages and why it's important to preserve them, because of the fact that there are words for things that there's no concept for in other languages. So it's like, how many things would we have we would have no way of conceiving them if we didn't have the Spanish for it, or much, even more, if we didn't have the indigenous way of looking at it. There just wouldn't be that. And then there's something beautiful that happens when the two languages come together. I edited with Denvera an anthology called ire'ne. And so we were writing about we were collecting the work of writers who had been fundamentally inspired by Antaldua's works. And it was all poets writing poetry and essay hybrids and things like that. But what was fascinating to me, it was actually my brother who found the title, ire'ne, because it is a combination of a Nahuatl and a Spanish word and concept, because there's no way to say basically like their souls in Nahuatl. But ire'ne is a Spanish transliteration or reconfiguration of Nahuatl. So it's mostly a Nahuatl word, but it's been sort of Spanishized in order to describe something that we wouldn't have had the words to do or to translate into English. But it's like we don't talk about these places where the languages do that. And then also like this whole thing of this argument of what's authentic and what's not authentic. And it's like everything is changing all the time. Everything is in flux. Culture's in flux. Language is in flux. I get into these crazy stupid arguments about tamales. Have you seen these, like, where people are like, it's tamal without an E, or it's tamale with an E, and the plural is supposed to be this. And I was like, I don't even care. Like, you can eat it with salsa, you can eat it with ketchup, you can eat it with mustard, you can do whatever you want with the tamales. I'm just happy people are still eating them and people still love them. Make your veggie, organic, whatever. Like, it's probably more indigenous than whatever, strange thing we're eating. But I'm just happy they survived 500 years later. So eat them however you want, say them however you want, pronounce them however you want, spell it however you want. Go back to tamale if you want. I don't care. What was it? Somebody was like, that one of the plurals would be tamales. TAMOLLIES, tamales, would be another way to spell it. And I'm like, I don't care. As long as they still exist, I do not care. Any kind of like this purist, whatever, what's authentic, what's real Spanish. I'm like, all we're doing is shaming people out of their desire to connect either with their Mexican or whatever Spanish influence they have, whatever South American, Latin American influence. And we do the same thing with indigeneity. You didn't grow up this way, you didn't grow up that way. Well, then you can't claim it at all. I'm like, that is an assimilationist tool to make us feel like we are disenfranchised from everything, and so we might as well be, join the general muddle, because we can't say we have this specific, authentic connection to this or that.
Speaking of Ansandua, I know one of your focuses in your poetry is the exploration of Chicana feminism akin to that of Gloria Ansandua. It's apparent in your work the tender and sometimes frighteningly intimate ways in which Femme Femme connections and histories are portrayed. Your poem, I Come From Women Illiterate and Roughskinned, is a poem I actually teach my students every semester. And they always end up loving this poem as a particularly great example of the intricacies of Femme Femme connection. So how did you arrive at this in your work? How did you come to know that this was a subject that was important, not just to you, but for the crafting of your work as a whole?
That poem in particular, I was actually filling out a grant application. And so the prompt was, I think they had like 5 different Virginia Woolf quotes. This was from a Room of Her Own Foundation. And they were like, respond to one of them in some creative way. Like it was a really like big whatever. And I love the quote that inspired that poem.
Yeah.
I think I even had it on my wall, like in college. Like I kept it posted because I wanted to look at it. But that particular day, I looked at it and I was like, that's not how my mothers came from. They weren't sitting down. They weren't inside the house. And it was after, this was probably 7 years after my mother had passed. And so I think I had been waiting for a long time to say these things about my mother and how I had grown up seeing what womanhood was.
Yeah.
Which is a very, it changes, culturally it changes, class-wise it changes. I'm like, we were out in the rancho, like one of the most awesome memories that I have, one day I'm gonna write about this, one of the most awesome memories I have of my mother, I was 5 years old. And one of my brothers, I forget what had happened, I think they hadn't run over a rabbit, but they had kind of stunned it.
Yeah.
And so he brought the rabbit home, and I don't know if he was thinking that my mother was gonna heal it or what, but she grabbed it, and I kid you not, it didn't even cool down. She broke its neck, she took off the fur, she like disemboweled it, and it was in a pan, and she was making mole like before I could even like realize or like accept what was happening.
Yeah.
And I refused to eat the rabbit, but I remember that. But I just remember how quick and strong her hands were, and how she just like with this impassive face, and then all of that boiled into all the other things I ever saw her do. And when you think about it, like, not sheltered women, but women who deal with caregiving, who deal with life and death and birth, who deal with healing people, who deal with illness, who deal with, you look at the histories of wars and how often, how much, pretty much all the time, women are raped and taken, and just all of these different things that happen, and we don't acknowledge that as part of the experience of women. And not even, only in times of war, all the time. You look at statistics for domestic violence and sexual abuse and all these different things, and it's an ongoing everything. And yet, how, like, it's a thing that induces awe, to think that in the middle of all of that, there are still women thinking and creating art and dreaming and nurturing daughters who want to create and paint and write and make art and live and be. And so just all of that came together that for that poem. And I love that poem. Like, I'll still read it now and just be like, it still chokes me up to think of my mother and to think of like the parts of her that I inherited. Because I think we do need to feel like there is an indebtedness. We do have an obligation, that other women shaped for us. Yeah. To speak and to teach and to learn and to create community, to bond with each other, all of that. So that's where that poem comes from. But I think for the parts of feminist thought and everything else that live in everything, it is because it seems like, I don't know, I hope there's less of it, but I did grow up in a very machista family, where like my father, like little things like my father's rage was what controlled everything. My father and my brothers, actually even my youngest brother, who loved to cook, was not allowed in the kitchen. I never saw my father ever pick up his plate, like not even to serve himself. Like his plate was never moved. It was that kind of really tight control. One of the things I think that was really horrifying, we were discussing, I think, sexual abuse with my dad, and I can't remember anymore how he said it in Spanish, I think because I blocked it, but basically in English it was, any unprotected woman is anyone's meat. And just the horror of that, to not be a person anymore, to not be a spirit, a personality, a heart, something that can be wounded, something that can claim or should claim its own space and have its own space just because a woman is born, but that you would be meat, for the use and exploitation of others. It was so deeply horrifying and so deeply outraged me. And every time I think of that, of how women's spirits get crushed and violated, it brings me back to that, that rage that is launched by love, because that's injustice. So how can we not talk about that? And I don't know, it gets me all the time how hard it is for women to claim their space,
mm-hmm.
to even be able to speak and say harm has been done to me.
Yeah.
You know, it boggles the mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's always something I come back to, because it's always something that you live with. It's always something you see. You know, at this point, you know, in my life, I think I've worked through a lot of stuff, but everything's new again when you hear a friend, or sometimes even somebody you don't know,
Yeah.
and they're confessing what's happened or what they've experienced, and it just, you know, it wells up all this tenderness and this love and this desire to like just hold somebody and
mm-hmm.
protect them, and also the desire to like burn some shit down and beat some people up, like,
yeah.
you know, all of that, or to just like rage against the entire world
mm-hmm.
for not perceiving that this needs to change.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it comes around again and comes around again and comes around in my work, it's because it's still there.
Yeah.
You know, so that needs to be, you know, it needs to be spoken and spoken and spoken and spoken.
Mm-hmm. And I love that. Honestly, every time I read your work, particularly when there's that tender moment, and there always is a tender moment, that Femme Femme connection, I do tear up, and I do feel inside myself this kinship. It's so beautiful and so strong. But you can't help but have that background of it's so beautiful, it's so strong, and yet there are people out there that want to crush it for some reason.
Yeah.
And I think you're doing brilliant work trying to poetically combat that and resist that. And I appreciate that.
You know, because it's, you know, you can't change people's minds.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, empathy and emotion and storytelling and hopefully maybe either creating a space where people can discuss difficult things,
Mm-hmm.
or creating spaces where people can feel seen or heard,
Mm-hmm.
empathize with, and not just the whole world saying your hurt doesn't matter. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You don't matter. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your stories don't matter.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the page is such a free space.
Yeah.
But we you know, we often fall into the traps of not being free on the page because we're told we're not free anywhere else. And so, but I was like telling people, why wouldn't I just write everything on the page? It's the freest, most welcoming space there is.
Mm-hmm.
Whether people publish it or not, you know, all the rest of it,
Yeah.
like I tell people, it's not my job to worry about, other than I throw it out there.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, on this part of it, is to get it on the page.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Love that. And that goes honestly straight into, what are your thoughts on obsession and poetry? So, some background context.
Mm-hmm.
Back in 2020, 2021, you visited my class in undergrad at
Mm-hmm.
St. Edward's University with Sasha West, and you had us write down all of our obsessions, the painful, the happy, surprising, all of it. How much do you think poetry relies on the poet's obsessions? How do you see this playing out in your own work? And what might the obsessions of Latina poetry be from your perspective?
Obsessions give you things to think about. And I think one of the most, I guess, useful ways that I found poetry to live in my life is that you can take an obsession. We'll take the example of Whataburger, because we were talking about this over lunch. So you could just write one poem about Whataburger and try to list everything you love about it and your experiences and be done. But I think what poetry gives you a chance to do, and actually one of the things that I have found really interesting about writing, I was telling Adela, she was talking about writing poems and then sort of collecting them into a collection. After my first book of poetry, every collection that I've written as a collection. Instead of disparate poems and then putting them together. It's like I've had a thematic concern or an obsession, and then, but what that allows you to do is that, let's, again, going back to Whataburger, you could write a poem about the burger. You could write a poem about the chicken sandwich. You could write a poem about the salad. You could write a poem about the time that you were 5 years old and you saw your father get turned away because he was Mexican and speaking in Spanish.
Yeah.
You can write a poem about your first love and having a burger at Whataburger and what that memory is. So obsession allows you to look at a thing from so many different facets and to examine all the different ways that, let's say, a place could be a site of horror, a site of fond memories, a site of identification. You can work it into, well, what does this mean in the community? Politically, what does it mean to have this attachment to this? And then what does it mean when you run into other people who have the same attachment, or run into people with ignorance? It's like it's almost like you can do a spiral then when you have an obsession. And so that's why I think obsessions are really fruitful. I mean, even in something, not even in something as large as a collection of poems, but even in an essay, where you can tackle it from, this is how I see it from this point of view, this is how I see it as part of my family, as part of a couple, in my young age, in my old age, you know, with 50 years of experience. Like, you can just look at it. But I don't know that we'd have the drive to do that if it wasn't an obsession. You know, so you need that. And then I think it's just interesting to know what I'm obsessed about at any moment. Like, okay, apparently I have an obsession about this and I didn't know it. Or you start thinking, this has come up in my conversation 20 times in the last week, or my mind keeps slipping back to this. There's something there. So it's very fruitful space for exploration. And then, as far as Latinas or Latina poetry and literature, you know, there are certain things, I think certain themes that get, you know, brought up: language, culture, inclusion versus exclusion, generational differences, you know, all these different violence, those get brought up and brought up. And I guess in some ways that's how, you know, we gel it all together. But I think what I find really interesting are all the differences. I think because I like looking at specificity. You know, exactly how is this person's understanding of the clash of languages different from this person's? You know, how is it shaped by experience, or by family, or by relationships, or what books they loved? You know, like you almost always ask a writer, well, what books did you first love? Because we know that's an important question. That was foundational. So how did these experiences of language shape you? You know, in ways that, you know, other people weren't. Because they were only looking at one language. So that's what I find fascinating. Is that sort of the obsessions, and then the differences in our obsessions. And I'm curious to see like what other obsessions end up coming up as time goes by, or like things like I get really excited. I'm working on a couple different projects, but one of the things that I'm really excited by, I was doing a workshop on women writing graphic sex, because I find that there's very few women that will actually write it. You might find it in like romance novels, but it's treated a certain way. But in more literary fiction, you don't find it. And there's lots of times when I've read several novels that I feel like something was missing, like something wasn't explained to me about the relationship. I don't know why the two main people are still together. Like, I don't understand what's going on. And you're missing out on all these dynamics we don't see, not just you know, power dynamics and relationship, just different ways that people perceive things. And we're missing out on it. We just don't have it, or we just don't see it. But one of the things I ran into was that when I did this workshop, like there was one time I had, I want to say 10 or 12 participants. I had put 2 hours of writing prompts and different exercises. It went 4.5 hours long. Because the first 2.5 was shame, body image, relationship stories of trauma, before we could get to any of the writing prompts. So like one of the things I would be fascinated to see, or that I'm looking forward to seeing, is as, you know, more writers, more Latina writers specifically, you know, are writing different things about sexual identity, sexual experiences, gender identities, whatever they're doing, like these places that we haven't gone yet. Like what's going to emerge from that as people feel more free and more empowered to write those experiences down. Like there's so much still for people to write. I mean, again, I don't know if she said this or not. I might be paraphrasing her horribly. But Bell Hooks in Remembered Rapture, and I'm pretty sure that's where it comes from. She says something about that there could never be enough books written by women because historically there have been so few.
Yeah.
And she's like, and even more when you think, well, believe she says, she uses the phrase women of color, but BIPOC women, we'd never be able to catch up.
Yeah.
So we can write and write and write and write and publish books and pile them up, fill up libraries, and we still would not get to the point of really like documenting the entire experience of, of the universe, of women of color in the universe. And so, so people feel like there's too much of an explosion, or there's too many, Latina writers, whatever. We can fill up buildings. We can fill up buildings. So I'm so curious to see what people are going to write.
Yeah, me too. It's an exciting time. I would say it's always an exciting time when you're a part of multiple communities, but particularly when you're a part of like the Latina literary community. There's so much room for potential.
Yes.
And so the sky's so high. We've only scraped so much.
Barely. Barely. And and then you start getting. There's so much.
Yeah.
There's so much to do. And then these expectations that presses or the market or whatever might have about what is the right immigrant story or what's the right Latina story. We can't get trapped by those.
Yeah.
We can't get trapped by, okay, this is the only kind of story that will sell. This is the only kind of story that will become a movie. There's so much to write. There's so much, there's so much freedom to live, in our creativities.
Yeah, for sure. My final question, and it's more like an interest question. So something I like to ask a lot of poets is just if you could conceptualize your poetic style or your thinkings on poetry or your approach to poetry, your love for it, your hate for it, and compile it into a tattoo that you would literally have just right there bared for all to see, what would that look like?
This one. That's what this one is.
Yeah.
This one's for writing, and this one's for life, and this one's for everything. I'm trying to figure out what is the short part of the longer story to tell you. There's a lot of connected parts. I think that's a whole other book on its own. Okay, the last part. So I wrote like this little flash fiction piece because I've always been curious. People always talk about Guadalupe in relation to either Coyolxauhqui or to Huitzilopochtli.
Yeah.
But I was always curious about how Guadalupe came to look the way she does. Why doesn't she have a human-looking head? Why does she have the two serpents? Why does she have talons and claws? And I found it, when I was doing my research, the little rabbit hole research things you go on. And apparently there was a story that the world was going to end, or people were going to end. And so some of the gods had to sacrifice themselves. And so she did. But instead of dying completely, she basically was rebirthed, but with the two heads of the serpent. And instead of human hands and human feet, the talons and claws.
Yeah.
And there's a line, it was interesting. So I wrote that little piece about choosing not to die, choosing to live, even if one has become what others would call monstrous, and how monstrosity and divinity are connected.
Yeah.
And I read it to my brother, who, while he was alive, was my absolute best critic, and he said, "You're missing something." And so I looked at it, and I looked at it, and I looked at it, and I added one line to it, which for me completed the whole thing. And the line in it is, "I am my own mother first." Again, because she's always connected to the daughter or the son or the sons. But to think of like how we create ourselves and recreate ourselves, and how we survive and what we choose to survive, and what we're unable to do anything but survive.
Yeah.
So that for me is what poetry is, and what a life with poetry in it is.
Yeah.
It's about how we birth and rebirth, how we create and recreate, how we keep surviving. And then my big thing with surviving, when I was writing Blood Sugar Canto, the very last poem I wrote was the shame poem. And I was like, there's absolutely no way that I can say this book is finished if I don't write a poem directly addressing shame.
Yeah.
But yes, that whole idea of You know, we survive things, and especially I think for women and for people of color and for poor people, you're shamed for surviving what you survived.
Yeah.
You're shamed for having had to survive it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that might be a very powerful place from which to start claiming space.
Mm-hmm.
To say I survived and I'm not ashamed of it.
Yeah.
You know? So that's why I have, like, I don't know, at least 10 more books to write before I give up on it, because there's so much to say about that, you know?
Yeah.
All the things you survive and all the different ways that that you change and transform in order to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And then not just to survive, but to live joyfully and in ways that make you feel complete and connected.
Yeah.
And how many times you end up having to do that,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And
Yeah.
something else comes along and happens. Like I said, life, pain, and suffering.
Yeah.
So
A constant reconfiguration.
Yeah. So you're having to reconfigure, but
Mm-hmm.
but without claiming the identity of being perpetually wounded.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually my friend and I last week when we were driving around California, there's a song that I love from Chavela Vargas, and there's a line in it that says, and I'm also probably gonna butcher it, but y ser feliz es el color de mi identidad. You know, to be happy, that's a color of my identity.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, how often is that claimed by people of color or by women or at any point in time, just to say that happiness, that's my identity. That's how I want to be identified.
Yeah.
When I wake up in the morning, that's who I want to say I am. You know, to do that. I think it's ni de aquí ni de allá. I think that's the name of the song. But yes, no, I love that line. I love that line so much.
Pure poetry right there.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Beautiful. Alrighty, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cool, and with that, we wrap up this interview with ire'ne Silva. Thank you so much for joining us. And we are extremely honored that you have come to the United States. What the hell is wrong with me? University of Notre Dame, there you go. Thanks so much. It's been a personal treat for me. This was a selfish for me, but I hope you all enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you.